Introduction. Basketball is one of the most popular indoor played games ever. It can be thought of as the indoor soccer, considering the game's global following and familiarity with it that rivaled soccer. Indeed, just like soccer has millions of fans and a club that hosts national championships every 5 years, played on a large field, basketball has its own association governing and guarding it and contributing further to its ever-growing development. Several sources of data suggest a huge following. The most reliable figure, perhaps, is the 250 million figure that is also proved by the NBA, considering that the game is not just played in North America, but nearly every country in the world, barring just an exceptional few that have not really been introduced to the sport. In light of this, it becomes very important for laymen and sports people to know the beginnings behind a phenomenon and how it went on to become such a global phenomenon. Several hundreds of inventions and innovations take place on our planet daily, but only a fraction of those new developments really evolve and occupy a permanent place in our civilization. In sports, be it something like soccer or just tennis, each has its own journey that can be traced back thousands of years, even if it may seem that a new invention took place just a couple of years or months ago. For basketball, that journey is quite brief but immense. It laid the foundations of American sports and led people of several cultures and communities to join hands and compete for gold medals. Basketball, indeed, throughout its past, has actively railed against racism and still continues to do so. In consideration, basketball is more than just a sport. It's a kind of ideology woven in the form of a professional sport and presented in the most colourful manner possible. Chapter 1. The Inception. Like all other sports that exist in the world today, basketball has had its own history and origins. It can be thought of as an unlikely candidate when it comes to ancient antiquity, as such other sports like football or even cricket share, owing to their origins in the Middle Ages. Not to forget the Olympic sports, of course, that have accompanied mankind since almost 3 millennia. Considering the timeline of all sports concerned, basketball is actually a very recent addition, having been officially attributed to being invented in 1891 by a sports scientist and psychologist. This sports inventor was himself never very sporty-going by his usual looks, and several of his written documents or even his black and white photographs will give anyone the realization that basketball could have been an accidental invention. But the story behind the sport's origins is itself very scientific in nature. Nearly every invention in sports history has had some kind of logical or rationalistic beginning behind it. Football, for example, is a simple contest between two teams whose objective is to score as many goals as possible by keeping the ball at the opposite goal for as many times possible. It has its rules as any other sport has, and the game itself is a pretty old one. There are hundreds or even thousands of sports that are played by individuals daily. We do not even know each and every one of them, considering the regions that have long had an association with sports. In Africa, nearly every tribe plays its own sport as part of entertainment or mere simple tradition. Some of these sports are of an antique origin and their play is still extremely rough. Bushmen in Africa compete in full-fledged wrestling competitions without any safety gear or regulations for that matter. Such sports are seen as pure entertainment during the time of local festivities or even as traditions wherein certain groups are required to carry out procedures in the form of gameplay. Sport itself is a tradition in its own manner. When discussing about basketball, then one can easily conclude, going by some of its outline facts, that it indeed is one of the most recent additions in the world of sports and physical testing. Basketball was basically invented by Dr. James Naismith in 1891. Dr. James was by profession a physiologist and a sports scientist with interest in philosophy. As a youngster too, Dr. James was fond of several home sports. For example, his pet game during his childhood that involved knocking away a duck relic by tossing a stone on it. The duck used to get placed on a pointy surface and participants had to take aims on knocking it away. It was a local game played by school toddlers, mostly known as Duck on a Rock. The childhood game's primary concept got carried over several years ahead when Dr. James invented basketball in his middle age. During his school time, Dr. James studied in Canada and later moved to Springfield College, Massachusetts, where he would spend the rest of his life in. This is also the place where Dr. James invented modern-day basketball. Like all other sports that start with rudimentary steps, basketball started as a simple game with two peach ball baskets as goals where teams needed to drop the ball in those baskets. It was a simple invention. What Dr. James never knew was that this sport that he invented for local students of Springfield College to play inside closed rooms would fast become one of the most popular sports in the world. Even during his lifetime, basketball became a global sport with its first Olympic entry in the Berlin Olympics of 1936. Dr. Naismith's purpose for inventing such a sport was very clear. He wanted a game that played and looked very similar to football but inflicted lesser injuries on the players. Contrary to what we see in modern-day football, back in those days when technology allowed only simple equipment to be produced, the play style of this game was typically characterized as extremely rough. Football shoes worn during the Victorian era were characterized as extremely hard, made up of pure leather and capable enough of inflicting the most damaging of injuries, even disabling at times. Refereeing was not as developed as it's now owing to absence of cutting-edge technologies judges followed during a soccer match, and that allowed for a lot of foul play to go unnoticed. Soccer equipment and standards to make the game more playable came only during the last of the 20th century when technological advances allowed referees, professionals and equipment manufacturers to observe better standards and play styles. Dr. Naismith thus wanted a game that resembled soccer but was characterized as being lighter and putting less pressure on the physical aspect of competing teams. Although basketball has its own unique injuries and disabilities, it can well be said that in some instances it does indeed seem lighter than soccer. Dr. Naismith was also faced with another problem: the extreme cold of Canada and the college where he later taught. Dr. Naismith intended to invent a soccer-styled game, but one that could be played indoors in much smaller spaces, and thus basketball was born. The first known basketball court was thus designed in Springfield College, involving a simple wood-planked surface with two wooden baskets on either ends of the playing area. Rules were also formulated, with 13 of them provided by Naismith himself. These rules were as follows. First, the ball may be thrown through any of the hands. Second, the ball may be batted with any hands but never the fist. Third, the player must compulsorily throw the ball to one of his teammates and not run with the ball. Fourth, never to be used for holding the ball are arms and the body. Always hold the ball between the hands. Fifth, no shouldering or striking or pushing in whatever manner an opposing player, as that would amount to a foul play. Persisting behaviour would amount to a disqualification. Sixth, fist striking the ball is to be counted as a foul. Seventh, 3 consecutive fouls by one team is to be counted as a goal for the opposing team. Eighth, a goal shall be counted only when one team bats the ball into the opponent team's basket, provided that the opponent team does not move the ball once it's in the basket. The goal is also to be counted if the ball rests on the edge of the basket and the opposing team moves the basket. Ninth, if the ball goes out of bounds, then it shall be thrown in by the first person touching it, and the umpire will deal with the situation in case there is a dispute between two teams. The thrower is allowed only 5 seconds to throw the ball. Failing upon will result in a player of the opposing team handing the throw. If either team continues to delay the throw-in, the umpire shall call it as foul play. 10th. Time allowed is to be 15 minutes, divided into 2 halves with 5-minute break in between. 11th. The winning side is to be decided upon which one of the teams scores the most goals. 12th. The umpire shall be the judge of the whole match and shall record the goals both teams score and notify any foul play to the referee. He will also issue fouls and everything other duty that is performed or expected by a referee. 13th. The umpire is also expected to know the time of the match while deciding without influence or bias when a goal has been made. With these 13 rules, the sport of basketball was ready to be played between leagues and teams that soon started flooding basketball courts. Nostalgically, these very same 13 rules still form the basis of proper basketball play style. In the years that would come, basketball would soon emerge as one of the leading sought-after sports in schools and institutes across the eastern states, and it would only be a matter of time when it finally transforms itself into a global phenomenon. Chapter 2. Nascent Evolution. Perhaps the Mayans and Aztecs would have thought that one day their basketball-like sport would become a global one. In the 1500s, the Spanish travellers and conquistadors noted a strange sport the natives played. It involved a ball tossed by several players that had to be tossed inside goals that resembled baskets of modern-day basketball. These ancient people might have played the game even earlier, which makes basketball an ancient game. However, being of such coincidence, it was Dr. Naismith who introduced this sport to the world. Basketball got its first recognition in 1896, just 5 years after its inception, when 2 teams, the Trenton YMCA and Brooklyn YMCA, were sponsored and competed against one another. Early game style of basketball was very rough and actually got banned by the YMCA. Early charges in those times used to be a couple of dollars that in today's time might go into thousands. On every win, each player got his prize, with Fred Cooper winning $16, approximately greater than $1,000 in today's reference, and earning the first highest-paid basketball player in history. Such were the humble beginnings of this simple sport. The earliest basketball teams were also locally sponsored groups, mostly done by popular colleges and educational institutes of those times. Since sports itself had been an integral part of the education curriculum, basketball thus found its entry into several of the eastern colleges and states. During much half of the late 19th century, US was being unified after the Civil War had ended and the southern states had agreed on the Union's conditions. Since that era was a turbulent period for Americans, it was only during the 1880s and 1890s that the real unification work kicked off. Railways were laid down in southern states that bordered Mexico that had seen absolutely no urbanization and development except lawlessness and legendary tales of outlaws and cowboys. There were no institutes here. America then existed only in some of the northern and eastern regions, most notably of them being New York, Philadelphia and Boston. Boston and New York share much credit to basketball's early launches, as these were one of the first cities to host major basketball matches. Basketball also witnessed much popularity even during Dr. Naismith's time, when he still breathed. Shortly after the sport's inception and its debut in the local sports world, the NBL, National Basketball League, was formed. This league could be thought of as a precursor to the modern National Basketball Association, NBA, although there is a vast time gap between the former's terminations and the latter's formation. The NBL was very helpful in further popularizing the sport in the whole country. The year 1901 marked another landmark period for the game. Prior to the new century, basketball was played only by local collegiate and student teams, and this got changed as the new century turned in. Several new teams now started signing up for professional basketball matches, although the sport itself remained a very local entertainment means. Teams like the New York Celtics, Original Celtics, SPHA, Buffalo Germans, etc., were one of the first formed basketball teams. Now, almost a century later, all these teams have vanished, except the Harlem Globetrotters, an all-African-American team that still plays today, making it one of the oldest basketball teams still in existence. There were other teams that were active. Professional teams like Buffalo Germans and SPHA have already been listed above. During early 1900s, a new concept in basketball took over, what is known as barnstorming. Since basketball as a sport did not categorize itself as one of the professionally recognized sport, several of the teams that existed then were more like play-for-cash teams whose main purpose was to attract crowds and play for cash prizes. Top teams of those times like Original Celtics and Buffalo Germans dominated the arenas wherever they went. The Original Celtics won several basketball matches, but their win streak had become so common that their players lost interest and the team had to disband after several years. This was also pretty much the same story with Buffalo Germans and SPHA, South Philadelphia Hebrew Association. These teams joined several leagues that existed then, but because of basketball's local recognition, its leagues existed only for a tentative period. Most notable leagues of the 1900s were the Eastern League and Philadelphia League. All teams noted above joined any of these leagues according to the situation that prevailed. If one league became more popular, winning teams would join that league and vice versa. Here, the Original Celtics introduced their addition to the game that became an development. Several sources of data suggest a huge following. The most reliable figure, perhaps, is the 250 million figure that is also proved by the NBA, considering that the game is not just played in North America, but nearly every country in the world, barring just an exceptional few that have not really been introduced to the sport. In light of this, it becomes very important for laymen and sportspeople to know the beginnings behind a phenomenon and how it went on to become such a Introduction. Basketball is one of the most popular indoor played games ever. It can be thought of as the indoor soccer, considering the game's global following and familiarity with it that rivaled soccer. Indeed, just like soccer has millions of fans and a club that hosts national championships every 5 years, played on a large field, basketball has its own association governing and guarding it and contributing further to its ever-growing global phenomenon. Several hundreds of inventions and innovations take place on our planet daily, but only a fraction of those new developments really evolve and occupy a permanent place in our civilization. In sports, be it something like soccer or just tennis, each has its own journey that can be traced back thousands of years, even if it may seem that a new invention took place just a couple of years or months ago. For basketball, that journey is quite brief but immense. Chapter 1. The Inception. Like all other sports that exist in the world today, basketball has had its own history and origins. It can be thought of as an unlikely candidate when it comes to ancient antiquity, as such other sports like football or even cricket share, owing to their origins in the Middle Ages. Not to forget the Olympic sports, of course, that have accompanied mankind since almost 3 millennia. Considering the timeline of all sports, it laid the foundations of American sports and led people of several cultures and communities to join hands and compete for gold medals. Basketball, indeed, throughout its past, has actively railed against racism and still continues to do so. In consideration, basketball is more than just a sport. It's a kind of ideology woven in the form of a professional sport and presented in the most colourful manner possible.